looking after volunteers, doing bat and dormice surveys, particularly all in Kingswood. And she spends her life as a very busy ecologist and has agreed to give this talk tonight. So we've been looking at a number of issues about impact on wildlife. We've been considering in our previous talks weather and climate. And tonight we're going to look at something that's really important, and that's land use, what we do as humans with our land and how it has an impact on biodiversity. So, of course, I'm alluding to the built development that takes place and how we control that for, if we can make the best of that process for wildlife. Currently in Yatton and Congsbury, YACWAG is tracking 6 building developments, each with some potential adverse effect on local biodiversity. So Sarah is the expert on this, so without more ado, I'd like to say welcome, Sarah. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Right, I'll just share my screen. Hopefully you can all see that. Hopefully that should be full screen. So yeah, if you can't hear me, if you can't see something that I'm explaining, just put something in the chat or give me a yell. And yeah, I am happy to clarify things going through, but the plan is basically, or was at least, I'll try and be as quick as I can to chat for perhaps up to an hour, because it's a pretty complex subject. I'm going to try and be as quick as I can, but it does take a little while to explain certain things, and then there'll be time for questions at the end. Just to add a bit of a disclaimer, it's not a planning surgery, so I'm not here to talk about all the ins and outs of particular cases, and I can't really do that for reasons that all become obvious. And the other thing to say as well is that people, actually the planning system can be quite a personal thing for a lot of people, and this is my opinion, this is my professional opinion, it's my personal opinion, but other people might disagree, and I'm really happy to kind of discuss. Some of these areas aren't always clear, there's quite a lot of room for negotiation and disagreement, so you know it's quite important to say that. The final disclaimer, which isn't to do with planning, is that I've got my guinea pigs behind me, so if you hear any weird squeaks, scuffling, it's not me fidgeting, it's actually my guinea pigs. So yeah, just in case you're wondering what's going on. So I'm going to, I mean, I give training on the planning system for my professional institute, and the course takes a day, and it's a pretty packed day. So as you can imagine, we're just going to kind of skim the surface, and it's really kind of a needs to know basis, this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the planning system. Some of you will have really good knowledge of this already. I know some of you, really know the ins and outs of this, but just to make sure that everyone's aware, we're going to talk a little bit about spatial planning and also about planning applications and biodiversity considerations within that. We're going to talk about some case studies, a few local examples, a few other examples, and then hopefully make you feel a little bit inspired and make you feel perhaps like you do have some influence and you do have a role in the planning system. And I think it's actually a really nice talk to follow on from Chris Bering's talk and Nikki from Avon Needs Trees talk, because they were talking about these kind of big global scale challenges and issues, but also about what we can do locally. And the planning system, it does kind of incorporate that. It does kind of think more widely, particularly about national issues, and translate them into local priorities. But also the planning system is actually kind of moving on a little bit to do with the real nitty gritty. It is sometimes about that one patch of scrub that might be keeping breeding house sparrows in the area or that kind of thing. So it's kind of quite a difficult job actually, working in planning. And I think planners are one of the most underestimated professions. You have to have a legal mind, you have to think about the economics. You're not supposed to make decisions just on the political basis, but you do need to be aware of some of the political tides and shifts that are happening. And as well, you just kind of, you need to be able to balance lots of quite complicated information. Sometimes you can feel like you're not making anybody happy, and you can feel like, whatever the decision is, somebody's going to be upset or somebody's not going to agree with it. So it's actually quite a difficult role. You do need to be pretty robust to work in planning, I'd say. I once got a job because I was told that it looked like I wasn't going to cry. So if I was given a bit of a hard time by a developer or an applicant or by a consultant, so yeah, it can be quite a controversial arena and a difficult space to work. But yeah, just to introduce, I've been a member of YACWAG since 2010, and I've been doing planning work for pretty much the same amount of time. And clearly I'm a little bit addicted. I started off at Monmouthshire doing some maternity cover there, and then went back into working for the Wildlife Trust and doing some freelance consultancy. But clearly I'm a bit addicted because I've not been able to stay away. I should say I've never been employed directly by North Somerset Council, but I have worked on contract for them. I've also done some freelance work for them. I tend to help them out when they have when they're between ecologists, they have staff changes, or they have really large applications where they need a bit of an extra hand. So that's my role with North Somerset. I'm not here to represent North Somerset. I'm not a permanent member of staff, but I do work for them sometimes, so I do understand how things work there. My permanent job is actually 2.5 days a week. I work for Bath and North East Somerset at the moment. So that is actually my permanent job, working for them. And then I help out a couple of other local authorities. South Cambridgeshire in particular, I've been helping out for about 5 years. And it's really interesting because they're one of the busiest local planning authorities in the country. They tend to have a good 4 or 5 out of the top 20 large applications in a year. The biggest I've worked on over there was a new town of 6,500 houses. So it's quite a different scale. I mean, development in North Somerset can feel pretty fast and furious, but over in South Cambridgeshire, you know, it really is a different scale. And then in Baines, perhaps it's kind of, you know, a step down from that. We do have some large developments, but not usually the scale and intensity that you get in North Somerset, not on a regular basis anyway. So yeah, so it's quite interesting working for different authorities, and it gives me a little bit of a different perspective. So just to kind of introduce what spatial planning is and what planning can do, it's really important to remember that I think sometimes, especially like Tony said, when you're in the thick of 6 local planning applications, it can feel like planning's kind of having, or planning decisions are having a huge and very rapid change very quickly. But actually, we need to remember that most of the land use in the UK is not actually under development. We still have a lot of agricultural land, and there's certain things that planning doesn't control and doesn't influence. So for example, planning doesn't, or local planning, certainly spatial planning, doesn't decide on law, it doesn't decide on legislation. It might influence it, it might influence what's needed to try and control or shift land use, but it doesn't actually make laws. Another thing that people quite often get a bit confused about, and that headline down there says it all really, is that actually people think that local governments sometimes set housing targets. They don't, it's actually national government. And it's really common, and you know, well there you've got a headline about North Somerset, is that actually it's really common for local politicians to disagree with national housing targets. And there's some proposed changes to the way that national housing targets are set, which is causing quite a lot of upset in some local areas where they're expecting that they might be asked to provide even more houses. Obviously, if you have targets set at a national level and then implemented at a local level, sometimes you have a disconnect. And actually North Somerset is quite a good example of a local authority area which is incredibly challenging for development for some reasons which we're going to talk about tonight. But those targets have to be met because they're set by national government. So if you ever kind of feel that there's this kind of push-pull, you're actually right. There is, you know, it's the local government and national government don't always line up entirely behind each other. So sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. The same with setting national priorities. So local spatial planning, again, if there's particular issues which are really high profile, that might have an influence then, or a ripple effect, but mostly these kind of national priorities for political will to do with certain types of development get filtered down to the local level rather than the other way around. And actually land management is a really interesting one. So historically, we would say that planning doesn't really have a strong influence on land management. So we can't necessarily influence the way hedgerows are managed through the planning process if it's not a development site. We can't tell farmers how to manage their land. We can't necessarily restore habitats and for species at landscape scale through spatial planning unless it's a very large development site like that 6,500 houses. But that is changing a little bit, and biodiversity is kind of leading the way on perhaps having that effect where we're actually, development is kind of a catalyst for thinking a little bit more about what's happening in an authority area. And I will talk about that. North Somerset particularly has got some really interesting stuff that they've had for a couple of years around now to do with local planning policy that is changing some of that perhaps. And also, local spatial planning doesn't necessarily mean that there needs to be connectivity between what happens in one authority and another. Obviously, in some cases it makes sense. We've got the West of England Combined Authority where it makes sense that we work together in some cases. There are some schemes, we've got one in Baines at the moment in Bath and North East Somerset, which we also call Baines for short. And it's quite a contentious scheme in terms of transport impacts. So our council are talking to South Gloucestershire because a lot of their local residents might be affected, and making sure that we're both kind of on the same page. So there is some cross-boundary working, but by and large, local authorities kind of, you know, work independently and make their own independent planning decisions. So what local spatial planning does include is it's administered by authority area, or sometimes you have joint planning authorities. Over in Cambridgeshire now, Cambridge City and South Cambridgeshire, which I work for sometimes, are combined, but we still kind of, you know, have people who are allocated to different areas. The thing I think people quite often forget about local spatial planning, which is really important, people think it's kind of a green light to development, or it's a way of facilitating development. And they very often forget actually the local spatial planning really is actually about protecting certain assets and certain features as well. So it's not just supposed to be about earmarking sites for development. It is partially about that. It's partially about meeting economic needs and meeting social needs, including housing provision. But it is also about protecting areas that are important. So it's protecting areas for nature, protecting areas for heritage, flood mitigation, recreation. There's all sorts of reasons why areas need to be protected. And this is all set out in local spatial planning. The other thing, which is actually really important, and I'm going to talk about this in the North Somerset context, is actually it does allow some autonomy to local authorities to make their own local priorities and to make their own decisions about what they think is important in their area. And it does allow them, in the case of biodiversity, to say, well, this species is particularly important, or this area is particularly important, and therefore we need to recognise that through our local planning process. And there's something called supplementary planning documents where you can actually provide your own guidance documents, which can be adopted by your authority and then need to be used when considering planning applications. So it's actually quite powerful, really. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is local plans, spatial plans. I'm not going to go on and on about it. It's a pretty complicated area, as anyone who's ever been involved with this will know. And some local plans can take 5 years or more, sometimes in the worst case, to actually deliver. That's not how long they're supposed to take, but they can take a really long time. So all this is basically it's the kind of high-level strategic plan. So the local authority have got two things to consider, you know, to simplify it basically. They have to consider policy, so they can set their own local policies, and they also consider allocations. So that figure is publicly available. All this information is publicly available. And that you can see the website address at the top, but if you just type in North Somerset policies map into Google or whatever search engine you want to use, it will show you that. And you can find all sorts of information. And that map's a really good example. Basically, the red areas are housing allocations, the blue areas are employment, and then you can see all sorts of other shaded and coloured bits in there. And those are actually, like I said, some of that, part of that's Cadbury Hill, local green space, local nature reserve. The shaded green area is Greenbelt. So as you can see what I'm saying, is there's actually areas that are protected as well as areas that are allocated for development. The big black line is the neighbourhood boundary, the village boundary. So actually it's a really, really useful tool. And as I said, there's also these supplementary planning documents which kind of back up some of the policies that are put forward in the plan and provide some more detail. If you want to have a look in more detail at what applies in North Somerset for biodiversity, these documents are huge and they can be really confusing. And these are the two policies I would signpost you to. Again, you can find these really easily. To be honest, even when I'm doing my professional planning work for North Somerset, it's just easier if I just Google North Somerset Core Strategy CS4 and I find it straight away. So CS4 is the core strategy policy, and DM8, which is the weightier one, the one that's got more information in it, is in the Sites and Policies Plan Part 1. So if you want to kind of have a look at what North Somerset has set out as its own biodiversity policy, that's the place to look. And the thing to say as well is this all sits under national policy. So we have something something in England called the National Planning Policy Framework. And actually for biodiversity, it's a bit of a strange one, because it was actually slimmed down about 5 years ago, I think, or more than that now, maybe more like 7 or 8. And as a result, we ended up, I think people were quite worried about having a thinner document with less guidance in it, which is true in some cases. But actually for biodiversity, I think it's pretty clear, actually, the NPPF. It talks about not just ensuring no net loss, but also net gain of biodiversity, which is the direction we're moving in. And those paragraphs particularly, if you're interested in planning or policy at all, I'd encourage you to read, because they're really useful. I'm not going to expect anyone to look at all of that, but this is just an example of how much detail there can be in a planning policy. And this is probably one of the longest policies I've seen. This is North Somerset's DM8. And again, this is in the Sites and Policies Plan. And if anyone wants to have a read, they can do, but it's pretty comprehensive, as you can see. And this is what is expected for applications which come in North Somerset in relation to nature conservation. So yeah, it's not something which is taken lightly. This is something which is included in local policy, and it's a pretty hefty policy. So just to say as well that like with anything in local authority, or most things in local authority, local plans are actually incredibly democratic and consultative. And I know sometimes it can feel like you send off your responses and you never hear anything back, but I can assure you that it is always worthwhile commenting on the local plan. North Somerset's one is like a lot of authorities at the moment, being reconsidered for the next period. And I believe there's been some high-level consultation already, and there'll be some more detailed consultation in 2021. I'm not up to speed with the exact timescales and things like that. So you can actually register for updates on their website. And if you're interested at all in kind of influencing some of these high-level decisions on local biodiversity, I'd really encourage signing up and responding. And you don't have to be an organisation to do so. You can be an individual. There's perhaps a little more weight if you respond as an organisation or as a group, but it's still worth responding if you have any thoughts. And those thoughts can be on a specific site, or they can be on the policies as a whole. So, for example, over in Baines, we're actually doing an emergency update because we've declared, like North Somerset, an ecological emergency. And our emergency update to our local plan is going to include a biodiversity net gain policy. So, and we're tightening up some of our other policies as well to be in line with our ecological emergency. So there is actually quite a lot of weight and influence that these local plans have and local policies have, and it's well worth kind of making sure biodiversity is represented appropriately within them. So that's kind of enough on spatial planning. I'm happy to answer any questions on that at the end. But yeah, that's just kind of a high level introduction. So moving on to talking about planning applications, which I'm sure people are perhaps a little bit more engaged with or perhaps interested with. You don't need to fully understand all the jargon that's on this slide, but it's just giving you an idea of the kind of consents we have coming into local authorities, or in one case, going into the planning inspectorate on this slide. So the ones in bold are the ones that I deal with as an ecology officer responding to planning applications on a day-to-day basis. So we have listed building consents. Sometimes it doesn't need a full planning application, but it might be a listed building where, for example, they're putting in a new dormer window in the loft, or they're doing something which might impact on bats or other biodiversity. It usually tends to be bats because it usually tends to be very building focused, but not always. So I comment on those. There's what's called permitted development, which is kind of smaller scale schemes, or schemes which have got a different level of protection or a different level of requirement in planning law. And a good example of this is actually, again, you don't need to remember the jargon, but there's something called Class Q. And what that is, I mean, when I say this, it'll sound a bit more simple, it's conversion of agricultural buildings like barns to dwellings. And there was a change in the law, I think about 7 years ago, or 8 years ago, and it allowed these buildings to be changed with a much less kind of stringent set of criteria that they had to be assessed against. Now, biodiversity is still one of those criteria, as has been tested. Initially, it's not listed, but local authorities have to meet the law. So biodiversity is still one of those criteria. So we still look at barn conversions and things like that. And there's some really quite weird and wonderful conversions of agricultural buildings now. I've seen pigsties turned into dwellings, and actually it's quite interesting, some of the buildings that are functioning actually quite nicely as dwellings, even though on the outside they're kind of a steel husk that was an agricultural building. So it's been quite interesting in terms of architectural diversity, for sure, that change in the law. And then there's full planning permission or householder planning permission, which I think everyone understands. And there's this slightly more complicated issue, which I'm really happy to explain if anyone's got any questions at the end, but I won't go into in detail here, about outline consent versus reserved matters consent. And there's also something now called planning permission in principle, which adds even more complexity. So there's a couple of other types of consent that perhaps arguably the local authority ecologists should be involved with, but quite often aren't. So building regulations being an obvious one. Tree notifications, we don't very often get asked to get involved with tree notifications. That's usually the tree officers, but arguably there could be some impacts on biodiversity. And also the one at the bottom is actually goes to the planning inspectorate. So if anyone knows about the Portishead Rail scheme at the moment, that's in with that's in for examination with the planning inspectorate, and that's a different type of consenting process. It's called a development consent order, and that's for these kind of really big schemes or schemes that don't fit within the other boxes that usually get sent off to the planning authority. So yes, there's quite a range of types of applications that we might look at. This is the simplest way, the simplest diagram, believe it or not, I could find to represent the planning system, and it's still pretty complicated. So I'm not going to go on and on about this, but just to talk you through the planning process fairly quickly, an application comes in, the local authority decides whether there's enough information. If there is, the application's validated. Now this bit is the bit where you come in, if you want to come in, and that is that the local authority has a duty to publicise and consult on the planning applications. So in terms of publicising, most planning authorities release what's called a weekly list, where they let you know what planning applications have come in that week. So if you're eagle-eyed, or if you're really determined, you can have a look through the weekly list every week and see if there's anything that interests you or is near you. If you live really close, you will get sent a letter. And that depends on the scale of the scheme and the type of scheme as well. So yeah, so if you live on the street, or if you know, for small applications, if you live next door, you should get contacted directly anyway by the planning authority. And also they have a right to publicise it by putting a notice up. So if you see any of those planning notices, it's because there's a consultation in process, and they get taken down when that consultation is finished. The other thing is, so in the dark days before the internet, obviously it was much harder to comment on planning applications. Now everything is done on online planning portals. So you can at any point search by postcode, search by address, search by the date that applications have been registered, and you can find applications. So when I'm not, obviously, because there's a conflict of interest, when I'm not working for North Somerset, if I want to find out what's going on in my local area, sometimes I just put kind of the first 5 digits of my postcode into the online planning portal, perhaps every 6 months or so, and just see what's going on in my local area planning wise. There's also a planning map, so you can open up the planning map and zoom in and find out whether there's any applications in your area. So there's all sorts of ways that you can find out, but obviously if you want to comment, normally there's only a 21-day window, so you have to be kind of pretty on it to be able to comment. Sometimes it's a little bit longer if an application is bigger, or if there's information that then comes in that kind of changes the consultation period, but usually it's only 21 days. So after that, the planning officer kind of considers all the information, representations from some of the consultees like me. I also get consulted in the same way at the local authority, and I have a set period of time to respond as the Ecology Officer. Natural England sometimes get consulted on biodiversity. The planning officer, this is why I said it's a difficult job, they consider all of that. They consider things like road safety responses, they consider things like landscape, and in over 90% of cases, the planning officer, so they're a professional, but they're not elected. They're a professional appointed by the council as an officer. They make the decision in over 90% of cases, or at least in Baines. I don't know what the percentage is in North Somerset, but it's probably fairly similar. If an application has enough objections against it, public objections, if it's called in by a local councillor, or if there's another set of criteria, so if it's a particularly large scheme or a particularly contentious scheme, it goes to planning committee, which is a committee of elected members or councillors who then make the decisions, and they still get recommendations from the planning officer, but they are entitled to either agree or disagree with the planning officer. The thing is, with all these decisions, it's not an arbitrary I like it or I don't like it. It's all based on, or it should be all based on, law and policy, which is really important to remember. So when I'm commenting on schemes that affect my local area, I can't just say, oh, it's next door to me, or it's down the road, or I know someone that lives next door, I don't really like it, or even that I know there's hedgehogs there. I have to say, these are the legal reasons, or these are the policy reasons why I think this scheme does not meet the requirements. So it can be quite complicated, and you do need to be quite objective and sometimes take a bit of a step back and really think things through. And then, as we all know, planning can get granted, usually with planning conditions. Sometimes planning gets refused, but again, as I said, there has to be proper reasons for refusal that are linked to policy or law. And sometimes you get no decision, and then the applicant can appeal for non-determination, or what's called non-determination. So the applicant, if something's refused or not determined, the applicant has a right to appeal. If permission is granted and you don't like it, or perhaps YACWAG don't like it, if it's a scheme that affects wildlife in Yatton or Congresbury, you don't have a right to take it to a planning appeal with the planning inspectorate. But if you think there's not been a legally compliant process followed by the local authority in granting that permission, or any other body, even the planning inspectorate, you can take it to a court. So you do have a right. You've got quite a short window of time, I think it's 6 weeks, but you can take it to what's called judicial review, or basically a legal challenge essentially to that decision. It's an expensive thing to do, and it's not an easy thing to do, which is why it doesn't happen that often. But when it does happen, it's really useful for us because we get an idea of what the judge thinks is a legally compliant approach. So that's my whistle-stop tour of the planning process. And in that, basically, we have, I've told you where you can come in, where you can make your representations on biodiversity or any other issue. The local planning authority does have a duty to consider biodiversity. So, and that they've got a series of duties actually. Some of these are legal and some of these are policy, and some of these are just kind of best practice and what they should do. So we have, at local authorities, we have a legal duty to ensure compliance with wildlife law. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about wildlife law in a second. We have a duty to comply with local and national planning policy, like we do with any issue in the planning process. And actually, because of the NPPF, and now this is actually being strengthened by law, which is going to be really exciting, and I will say more about this, is that we have a duty to make sure there's no net loss and actually net gain of biodiversity. And what net gain of biodiversity means is a really kind of interesting area that I think is going to be opening up a bit of a can of worms, but also it's pretty exciting in terms of what it might deliver. We need to make sure we meet best practice guidance, including best practice on planning. So for example, we need to be proportional and reasonable when we're making planning decisions. We need to make sure that we've evidenced our decisions. As I said, we can't just say, I don't like something, and we have to be able to give a reason. And we have to make sure that whatever we put in place is actually enforceable. It's totally pointless for us to secure something for wildlife and not actually have proper conditions where we can enforce that, or proper legal agreements like something called a Section 106 agreement where we can really enforce that and make sure that's delivered. So, but we do need to be proportional and reasonable. So really, our ultimate aim for biodiversity, it's not always possible, I have to say, to get a win-win. It is possible in some cases, increasingly so, but it's not always possible. Sometimes we're making a bad situation slightly better, it has to be said. But I've been a planner for 10 years. I used to feel like I was always making a bad situation slightly better. And now I feel like in some cases we are getting a win-win, where we are getting green space that's also good for people. And that image on the right there is, I don't know if anyone's been there recently, but that is Olympic Village in East London. It's not local, obviously, but it is one of my favourite places for wildlife now. Certainly in an urban context, it's absolutely fabulous. And I know one of the ecologists who's a kind of urban designer as well, green infrastructure urban designer, who worked on it. And it's got orchids there, it's got really fabulous array of wildflowers, it's got these amazing wetland areas which are really heavily used by wildfowl and bats. Obviously in an urban context, it's not got our greater horseshoes, it's not got our water voles that we have in our area, but in the urban context for somewhere like Stratford, it's really amazing. So if you're ever near Stratford train station, well worth having a pop there. And it's also really well used by people as well. So it's just a really lovely space, which actually really brings something to the area. And it's actually really inspiring to see sites like that, even in quite urbanised bits of London. So I said applications, kind of when they come in, the local authority has some expectations before they're registered or validated. North Somerset are actually pretty hot on this as local authorities go. I actually helped them put together some of this guidance. It's not perfect, it's a risk assessment. But if you have a planning application that you see it come in, you have a look on the planning portal, or you get a letter. And on the planning portal, I should say, all the ecological information should be on there. So you should be able to see all the ecological surveys. You can read them for yourself. You can make your own decisions and judgments on them. You can comment on them. You can do whatever you like. You can use the information to help guide your local volunteering or your local surveys. It's all publicly available information, which is really incredible. But if you see a planning application come in, you have a look at the application online and you can't see any ecological information, you can actually go back to what's called the local list, or this list of requirements that the local authority expects. And North Somerset's list is online. It's, if you just look for North Somerset local list, again, you can Google it, or you can try and navigate through the planning part of their website. And it just sets out when ecological surveys are required. And it's quite a stringent list. There's one for ecology surveys as well as bat surveys. And then if you want an idea about what these kind of surveys might need to look like, if you see that a survey's been submitted, but you think, you know, it's 2 pages of A4 and it's not detailed enough, that document there, which I also help North Somerset produce, actually North Somerset are really good because they've got these leaflets they can send out to people. So it really spells out what a bat survey should look like, and there's one for ecological surveys as well. So they're quite useful documents to have a look at. Again, I'm not going to go into loads of detail on this because it really is a huge area. But if you want to try and understand what planning authorities expect with ecological information, there's something called Natural England Standing Advice. And you don't need to remember that web link. You can just, again, Google Natural England Standing Advice. It takes you straight there. And that front page then leads in, it's a bit of an Aladdin's cave of guidance, basically. And it leads you into link after link that tells you all about particular species or particular ecological issues, and it sets out what the survey requirements might be, it sets out what the mitigation requirements might be, and it's really useful. It's aimed at planners, but it's really kind of straightforward and readable because it's not supposed to be for a scientist or a specialist audience. It's supposed to be for a lay person to be able to look at, or for somebody who's not, you know, an ecologist. So yeah, it's actually really useful, and that's a really good starting point if you're trying to understand what's involved in the planning system and biodiversity. And then this is my favourite little paragraph. I mean, I actually have a favourite paragraph of policy, and it's this one, or guidance, it's this one, because it's got so much in it. And again, if you are concerned about a planning application, you think that there's not enough survey information, this paragraph is really useful. It's quite an old piece of guidance, but it actually, although the planning policy has changed, the national planning policy, this actually still applies. And I use this when I'm doing my planning work on almost a day-by-day basis. And the reason why is because it makes it really clear that protected species and ecological information is a material consideration in planning applications. So it needs to be submitted before the planning decision is made. And that quite often we get applicants saying, well, hang on a minute, can't you just put a planning condition on the application and then we can do a survey at a later stage? And this makes it really clear that actually that needs to be part of the decision, because the mitigation may have an influence on the design of the scheme. So if, for example, if you've got reptiles on site and the survey is conditioned, then where are you going to create space for them? If the scheme's already been consented, where are those reptiles going to go, or where are they going to be moved to? So that's why in most cases, exceptional circumstances apply, but in most cases, ecological surveys need to be done before planning decisions are made. It does, however, say in that paragraph as well, which is why I love it, that there has to be a balance of risk, basically. So there has to be reasonable likelihood of those species being present, and not just present, but actually affected by the development. So if you've got reptiles on site, but actually the scheme has been designed to keep the area that all the suitable habitat for reptiles, and there won't be any other impacts, then you don't need to do a survey for reptiles, which absolutely makes sense. And it kind of encourages people perhaps into, or it's supposed to encourage people into kind of retaining some of those important habitats and some of those habitats for wildlife. Ecology law, it's a huge area and it's a total minefield. And as I said, actually working in planning and being an ecologist, I kind of have to think like a lawyer quite often as well. But just to kind of signpost you again in the right direction, a lot of the local authority duties, the legal duties that we have, come from law. And one of the ones which I think people quite often forget about, actually, but it underpins all of this, is the Crime and Disorder Act of 1998. And this makes it really clear that local authorities cannot facilitate crime. kind of logically actually, but there's a lot of criminal offences in relation to wildlife in terms of harming, killing, injuring, removing their habitat, and that is a crime. So essentially local authorities should not be making planning decisions which facilitate or ignore crime, quite simply. There's these other laws, so the Conservation of Habitats and Species Regulations, that was actually the EU law that's now been transposed into UK law. There was a lot of concerns about that basically being watered down or changed. It's not been so far. I can't really see that happening with the public mood towards wildlife at the moment, to reassure you. I mean, I could be wrong. It is definitely a weakness now that can be changed by our government and doesn't have to go through the European Court of Justice, but I think it's fairly unlikely personally. We also have our own UK law, which we've had for a long time. So people think these biodiversity requirements are new in the planning system. They're not. We've had that one around since 1981. It's just perhaps being enforced more rigorously than it was back then. Badgers have their own law because they are protected because of animal welfare reasons, not because of rarity. They were actually one of the first species in the UK to be protected by law, interestingly. And that again is for welfare reasons rather than for rarity. We have the hedgerow regulations, which I won't go into, which we also need to consider. And then this one at the bottom is a law. It's actually a law. It's the Natural Environment and Rural Communities Act. And you don't need to know all about this, but the most important bit is that it makes it really clear what local authorities are supposed to be doing. And that bit of text down at the bottom right, where it says a public authority must have regard to the purpose of conserving biodiversity in all its functions, basically, to paraphrase. That basically makes it really clear that actually local authorities should be considering biodiversity in everything they do. And I think actually in the planning system, we're a bit ahead of the curve because there's some departments in councils which perhaps are not fully engaging with that and fully having regard to biodiversity in their functions, which is, you know, there's some departments where it's not particularly relevant perhaps, and it would be onerous to expect them to fully engage with biodiversity, perhaps areas like adult social care or that kind of thing. But there's other areas where definitely that's not perhaps given the weight that it should be in the course of law. And the other thing to mention with that act, I'm only going to mention this in passing, but we'll talk a little bit about protected species in a second, but there's some species that are not protected in the same way or given the same weight, but they are included in what's called Section 41 of the NERC Act. I told you this was complicated. But a really good example of this is hedgehogs. So hedgehogs are not actually legally protected from killing or injury, perhaps slightly surprisingly. Their habitat is not protected, but they are listed on the NERC Act, which means that when a local authority is making decisions, they have to fully pay regard to the species and habitats, which include things like, it might surprise you to know, every native hedgerow in the UK. Doesn't have to be an important hedgerow, doesn't have to be a species rich hedgerow. Every native hedgerow is on Section 41, and local authorities, when we're making planning decisions, have to pay due regard to conserving every native hedgerow, hedgehogs, common toad, and anything else which is on Section 41. So actually it is a really useful addition that we've had in terms of law. I'm not going to go into loads of detail with everything on protected species. It's a whole massive area, but just to say that all those species on the slide, plus some others, including great crested newt, hazel dormouse, are protected under those two laws, the Conservation of Habitats and Species Regulations and the Wildlife and Countryside Act. They are protected in some different ways. So for example, reptiles are protected just from killing and injury, whereas those species on the 4 species on the left there are actually protected even from disturbance. They're protected from a place of rest or shelter being removed. So you can't remove a bat roost legally without a license. And all wild birds are protected from killing or injury. Those plants are actually, they're a little bit of a quirk in the law. So Himalayan balsam is the beautiful pink plant that I'm sure you've seen, is in the same camp as kind of Japanese knotweed. But there's other species that you might be surprised about, like Virginia creeper even, Cotoneaster, some species, 5 species of Cotoneaster, they are all on the Wildlife and Countryside Act as species which it's illegal to deliberately spread in the wild. So I still see planning applications suggesting planting Virginia creeper, and I have to say, well, actually that would technically be dodgy because it's actually listed as a species where it's illegal to deliberately spread it. And garden centres are still selling some of those species as well, which is quite surprising. And bluebell are actually an interesting one. You can't sell bluebells, but you can pick them for your own use as long as you've got the landowner's permission. and you can actually dig them up as long as you have the landowner's permission, which might sound a bit strange, but a lot of them grow in woodlands which need a little bit of management intervention. So I think that's why the law kind of sits like that. And there's some other plants which kind of have those quirks. So yeah, it's a whole geeky area where you can kind of go down the rabbit hole on this. Although rabbits are not protected under UK law. Certainly not in the same way that those species are in development sites. They're protected from certain ways of killing, basically, rabbits. So that map on the right shows you all of our what's called statutory or legally designated sites in North Somerset. And when I said we're in quite a constrained area for development, you can kind of see why, really. There's a lot of orange on that map. And if you add on some of the other constraints, things like flooding, for example, some of the green belt, it really does get quite difficult to find places to develop or to put our housing allocations or other allocations without kind of butting up against a protected site. So we have different types of protected sites, again, under these different laws that I just told you about, which I won't waffle on about exactly which bits of the law they're covered in. But the way I've separated them out there is quite a useful way to think about it. And the kind of simplest way to explain this really is there's sites that are internationally important, and those are the top three there. So we've got something called SACs, or Special Areas of Conservation, and which can be designated for habitats or for certain species. So on the regulations, there's a list of certain species where if you have enough of them, or if it's an important enough site for them, you can designate it as an SAC. So believe it or not, there's actually some SACs for otters around the UK. There's some for great crested newt, and locally we have some for bats, which I will talk a bit more about. We also have, I think lumping those together is actually fair enough, Ramsar sites and also special areas of special protection areas. And those are kind of wetland sites that are designated for birds. So it probably won't surprise you at all to know that the Severn Estuary is actually all three of those. So we have a rather large stretch of the Severn Estuary on our coastline, and parts of Western Beach, for example, are actually part of that European, what was a European and is now a UK designation of international importance. Western Beach is within this area of international importance for wetlands, which might be a bit unbelievable if you've been down there in the summer and seen the donkeys, but yeah, it still qualifies. Out on the mudflats, there's some really fabulous bird populations. So those sites, the reason that they're given a kind of higher level of protection through the law is because they are internationally important, and it does mean that the local authority has some additional requirements. Now this is quite a complicated area, but I did want to talk about it because it is quite relevant to a lot of our local planning decisions, which hopefully as I go through the next few slides you'll start to understand. And basically, to kind of simplify it, these sites, so if I talk about the bat sites, for example, it makes absolutely no sense just to protect a bat roost and not all the habitat that supports the bat roost. So these bats need to go out in the landscape, as we know. They need to feed, they need to travel through the landscape. So it's not just the roost itself that's protected, it's what's called functionally linked habitat. And it's the same for the birds on the estuary. If they're coming inland, if they're leaving their designated area, they don't know they're leaving their designated area and they're coming up a creek, or they're coming inland to feed, perhaps on some of those salt marshes around Clevedon that are slightly off the SSSI or the SAC or the SPA, then they are still, those habitats are still important for them and they are still protected. So basically, if you get a housing development that's proposed right by or within perhaps 1 kilometre of where these greater horseshoe bats breed at Brockley Hall Stables, then the applicant actually has a legal duty to demonstrate beyond what's called reasonable scientific doubt. So it's quite a high bar of evidence they need to provide that there won't be any significant negative impacts on that bat roost, that they won't be causing the collapse of that bat roost, or they won't be causing the bats to be displaced and have to find somewhere else to feed. And the local authority has a duty to review all the evidence and then make its decision in what's called a habitat regulations assessment. So this is really important because actually around Yatton and Congsbury, we've got quite a lot of development pressure, and quite a lot of these sites, because we're so close to some of these big bat reefs, not so much the Severn Estuary, but certainly the bat reefs we're having to consider very often whether or not there'll be an impact which will destabilise or cause a negative impact on those bat reefs in terms of their ability to reproduce and feed. So it's quite important actually, and it's quite amazing, and we should feel quite proud that we have some of these internationally important sites for nature conservation in our very local area. Now, of national importance, we have sites of special scientific interest, or SSSIs, which I'm sure you've all heard about, and some of these, for example, around Yatton, include Biddle Street. We have local nature reserves, which are also designated under the law, but not enforced in quite the same way as SSSIs are. And then we actually have local wildlife sites. So these aren't legally designated. These are really important though. So these are kind of our network of locally important wildlife sites, and quite a few of the YACWAG nature reserves fall within these local wildlife sites. I mean, some of the YACWAG nature reserves are within or right next to the SSSI, but some of them are also local wildlife sites. And these aren't protected by law, but they are protected through local planning policy. And if you have a development that's proposed on a local wildlife site, it would usually be an objection if it's going to adversely affect that local wildlife site. So they are really important. They are, the designation of them is decided by BRERC and a local sites panel. It's not reviewed as much as it was. A lot of these designations date back to the 80s and 90s, and there's no duty with local wildlife sites. With SSSIs, there's a duty to make sure that they're maintained in a favourable condition, and the same with those internationally important sites. With local wildlife sites, there's not. So, for example, if you have a field of species-rich grassland that's a local wildlife site, if it came in for a planning application, we could try and secure it, or we could say no, or we could object. But if a farmer wants to just plough it up and plant maize in there, they can do. So it's not actually protected outside of the planning process. So sometimes we do try and take an approach where we're trying to secure positive management of local wildlife sites through the planning process. So yeah, we all know we live in a lovely area for wildlife, and this just confirms it. So again, this is from the North Somerset policies map, and this just shows you really what we already know, that Yatton and Congsbury have a fabulous array of wildlife sites. So you can see there we've got a special area of conservation for bats in Kingswood. There's one just up the road in Brockley as well, Brockley Hall Stables. We've got lots of local wildlife sites that are protected through local planning policy, those kind of darker green speckled areas. We've got a couple of SSSIs as well, quite a network of SSSIs with the Reens. So it really is quite incredible to kind of see it like that. We've got local nature reserve, Cadbury Hill. So we know we live in a good area for wildlife, and this basically is just confirmed through the local plan. I did say I'd talk a little bit more about the North Somerset amended bat sack, because that is one that really does affect us locally. That picture at the top left, that's Brockley Hall Stables. I'm sure loads of you are really aware of what's going on there. But actually, in 2001, there was 80 bats, and there's now, last time I spoke to Vincent Wildlife Trust who monitor it, they said there's 800 in there now. I mean, it's been pretty phenomenal. Vincent Wildlife Trust have done an incredible job of looking after that roost and encouraging it to grow. And we've had species recovery as well. And I think if anyone sometimes feels a bit negative about what's going on in North Somerset with land use or land management change, I think we can feel a little positive actually that our bats are recovering, and they do seem to be doing fairly well, perhaps despite of some of the challenges that are being thrown at them. There's some radio tracking going on of these bats this summer, and it'll be really interesting to see. The North Somerset have commissioned. It'll be really interesting to see what comes back from that. The picture on the bottom left, some of you will recognise, that's the footpath up from Congsbury, and that's Kingswood. And there's over 100 mine entrances in Kingswood. I help the landowner with monitoring some of those in kind of on a voluntary capacity. And one of them has got five entrances that are connected, form a maternity roost, and there's actually over 150 bats, great horseshoe bats, there now breeding underground as well. So we have a population of edging on over 1,000 greater horseshoe bats locally, and this is a species where there's 12,000 nationally. So it really is incredible, and it's really important, and we perhaps have one of the most urbanised and perhaps the most under pressure greater horseshoe bat populations. So it's going to be really interesting to see how they adapt and cope with some of the land use changes and pressures that are being thrown at them, basically. And it's a constant challenge at North Somerset Council to kind of balance some of these other constraints with the requirements for these really, really special internationally important bats. There's also lesser horseshoe bats, which are there's a few more lesser horseshoes around, perhaps as many as 50,000 nationally, but they are still really important, and we know actually YACWAG members who've got some lesser horseshoe roosts in their buildings, which is incredible. There's a few maternity roosts around Cleve, for example, and they do roost in the woodlands as well. So really important sites for these bats. North Somerset Council have been pretty revolutionary, I have to say, out of all the authorities I've worked at, about recognising this. And with the help of Larry Burrows from Somerset County Council, they produced and adopted in 2018, which means it was signed off by a committee of councillors. This document that basically is a supplementary planning document. I'm not going to go into all the detail of it, but it's well worth a read. There's some technical stuff in there about how you calculate habitat loss and that kind of thing, which you don't need to worry about. But there's some really interesting information actually about these bats and how they are now being considered through the planning process. And hopefully, just through a couple of examples, I am going to just kind of, show you how these are now being considered. So the picture on the right there is in this SPD, the supplementary planning document. And it was based on a model that shows where the really important areas for these bats are around the protected reefs. The protected reefs are shown in blue there. And as you can see, Yatton and Congsbury are parts of the eastern edge of Yatton and Congsbury, including Cadbury Hill, are in Band A, which is the really critical bit where the juveniles feed and the lactating females. And then the kind of darker yellow area is Band B, which is also really important for sustaining these roosts. So we now have this information which can be used to guide spatial planning and planning applications, which is really useful. And I'm going to give you a few examples of how that's been used. If you have a planning application in your local area and you want to know whether it might have an impact on a triple SI or one of these really important bat sites, there's actually a tool you can use on a website called Magic. And if no one's used Magic, it's actually Magic, it's brilliant. It's www.magic.gov.uk. And it's got loads of biodiversity information on it. You can have a play with it. It shows you where ancient woodland is. It shows you where grazing marsh and priority habitat is. It even will show you where Natural England did a big study of great crested newts a few years ago. It shows you where their records popped up. It wasn't exhaustive, but it's a good idea. And this, if you go on the land-based designations, you might have to turn off the big pink blob that comes up for the nitrate zones. But these purple contours here were produced by Natural England. And if you click on it, if you click on the little kind of information button at the top, I'll show you the little I button at the top, and then you click in one of those contours, it tells you when Natural England expect that there may be impacts on the SAC or the triple SI, and what kind of applications might cause an impact. So it's really useful if you have, I don't know, 4 houses going in the field next door to you, and you're a bit worried that they haven't done any assessment to do with the horseshoe bats that might be feeding there, then you can actually just bring up this layer, click on it, and this will tell you where Natural England expect there might be impacts. So in the case of the area I clicked in, any planning application outside of an urban area. So it's quite and that would normally trigger the need to consult Natural England, which means that there may be impacts on the triple SI. So quite a useful tool. These are also really useful. If you want more information, I would strongly recommend, these are just 2 examples. There's guidance documents for water voles, great crested newts, hazel dormouse. Most of them are freely available online, not all of them, but most of them are. These ones are. The CIEEM is really useful. That's our chartered institute. So they have quite a lot of things on their website. Bat Conservation Trust have these guidelines on their website. There's some other guidelines to do with lighting and bats. So there's loads of information out there. They might seem a bit off-putting, but actually they are written in a way which is pretty accessible. So again, if you see an application come in and they've done 2 bat surveys and you think, oh, I don't think that's enough, then you can have a look in these documents and actually kind of work out whether actually they've met the best practice guidance or not. And I have actually seen, I won't say who, I've seen a YACWAG member do this successfully for a planning scheme in Clavering, and put a case together based on having read the guidance and putting kind of a really robust case. And that person actually reported the consultants for non-compliance with the guidance to CIEEM in this case, who regulate the professional conduct of ecologists. So so you are actually empowered to look at these and to make your own decisions and to hold ecologists to account if you feel like professional ecologists have not done a robust enough job in line with their own guidance. And the other thing that's really important, which is kind of a fundamental principle of everything we look at, and it totally makes sense actually. I don't think it's always recognised. I have to say, I sometimes struggle to insist on it in schemes, but we are, when I started in 2011, this mitigation hierarchy on the right was not really being followed very often. And if I tell you about things like hedgerows is a really good example. What used to happen is hedgerows just always used to get ripped out. Developers would start with a clear site and then kind of, you know, maybe if we were lucky, put some hedgerows or some planting back in. And now it's quite rare to see a development site where they haven't actually tried to avoid taking the hedgerows out. So the first thing that you should be doing with schemes is avoiding removing habitats or removing features for protected species. If you can't do that, then you need to mitigate and minimise the impacts. And then if you can't do that, you should look to compensating, but you should be trying to avoid impacts first through scheme design, which is why it's really important that these ecological surveys are done really early and inform not just planning, but also the way that these projects get designed. So I'm just gonna, for the last kind of 10 minutes or so, I'm just gonna run through a couple of case studies, starting with one that I'm sure everyone will take a bit of a sharp intake of breath over perhaps. I should say I was actually working for North Somerset on this one because it was quite a large scheme. I'm not going to tell you all the ins and outs of it, but it's all publicly available. If you want to watch the planning committee, it's still up on YouTube. It's a fascinating watch. I've never been involved in a scheme which has been quite so emotive and divisive, and it was really interesting and incredible actually to be there. I just felt a bit honoured and privileged, which sounds weird about a planning committee, but it was just amazing to see how impassioned on both sides people were about this, and I could kind of understand the arguments from both points of view. It's not my job to make a decision on those arguments because a lot of them were economic and that kind of thing, which I don't take into consideration as a biodiversity officer. And this one was a bit of a challenge for me because, like most of you, I live under the flight path. I have some personal views about the airport expansion, but my job isn't to have personal views. My job is to look at this objectively as a professional ecologist. So that's what I had to do with this scheme, which was quite interesting. But it's just quite an interesting example, really, of kind of picking out the biodiversity issue. So if anyone's not aware, this was the application for Bristol Airport, not just Bristol Airport generally, but to increase its passenger through flow from 10 million passengers per year to 12 million passengers per year. They already have permission for 10 million passengers per year. So it's a 2 million passenger per year increase. But obviously from biodiversity, the passengers themselves, that's not necessarily the impact on biodiversity. The impact is all the infrastructure that's required to allow that. So basically, the main impact on biodiversity was that they were taking out one field, which is used by cattle for cattle grazing, which obviously is really important for horseshoe bats, and that was for a car park. And then they were also making some changes to a woodland, which was also found to be used by horseshoe bats and other wildlife. So that was my main consideration. I did also have to consider whether things like aircraft flying over would disturb wildlife and that kind of thing. So I'm not going to go into loads of detail about this. I'm really happy to talk about this at the end in more detail if anyone wants to. But basically, it was reported by a few people that birds might be displaced with planes flying over the estuary. And in discussions with Natural England, the airport actually did a really good job of providing lots of information about the levels that planes fly at and how close they go over the estuary and Chew Valley Lake. And it was impacts on those bird populations, or certainly significant impacts, ruled out. They might need to, in an emergency situation, they might need to come in low every so often. You know, a police helicopter might need to come in low every so often, but it's not going to be happening on a day-by-day basis, particularly in relation to that 2 million passenger per year increase. So we could rule that out. And the same with disturbance over those bat reefs. However, they were removing about 4 hectares of habitat. So that was their big issue in this scheme. It was removing that habitat for the car park, particularly the cattle grazing, within about 4 kilometres of those big greater horseshoe maternity reefs. So I'm going to show you in a minute what they did to mitigate that, which is really quite interesting. And when I was talking about landscape scale stuff, this is kind of the seed of, this was the first application that proposed some off-site mitigation, and it's really interesting. And it you know, there's pros and cons of this, but certainly it's an approach which kind of opens some doors for organisations like YACWAG and also for some landscape scale change. Bristol Airport, actually, really interestingly, they've been doing quite a lot of expansion to car parks and things for quite a while. And one of their Silver Zone car parks that they expanded about 7 or 8 years ago, they've got really good evidence actually that horseshoe bats are using their mitigation. They put these bunds in that they planted, and they've done some quite sensitive lighting around the edges. And as a result, they've actually recorded a huge increase in greater horseshoe bat activity around the edge of the airport. So basically, the foraging habitat, yes, it is being lost, but the bats are still dispersing really nicely around the edge of the airport and in even bigger numbers, which is quite interesting. There's possibly some other reasons for that, including the reefs having increased in size in that time. That's no small part, but there is definitely some kind of evidence that some of their mitigation they're putting in there, certainly for these flight corridors, is working, which is really interesting. So overall, I couldn't object on the basis of damage to these internationally designated sites from a biodiversity point of view. And there we go, that's that area there. So this is from their documents. So this is from the based on that SPD, and that's the legal document that I wrote for North Somerset that Natural England signed off. And that little blue dot you can see in there, that was where they were proposing actually to compensate for that loss of that foraging habitat by changing some coniferous woodland to deciduous broadleaf woodland and kind of wood pasture, opening up the canopy. Now that area is much closer to the bat reefs. It's still accessible to the same bat population. And the airport, I believe, actually purchased that land. So depending on what happens at the planning appeal, that may still happen. And they were intending on managing that into a better state for the horseshoe bats to compensate for the loss of habitat on the site. So it's quite interesting, actually. I know some people have views on this. I have my own views on this. But actually, this meets the guidance document that North Somerset has put out. And potentially it's actually, quite a positive thing for the bats that are feeding in relatively low numbers actually around the airport. So yeah, it's quite interesting actually that was the solution that was proposed, and perhaps quite encouraging in terms of being able to facilitate change of landscapes outside of development sites. I won't go into this in too much detail, but there was some other kind of minor concerns about harm to Felton Common Local Nature Reserve, which is next door. But actually, on balance, there's some acid grass in there, there's some neutral grass in there. It's a pretty nice site. On balance, I couldn't really object on that basis either, because actually they had an air quality specialist who said that there was going to be no significant deposition, and we would be arguing about non-significant changes. And I'm not an expert on that, so basically I just stated that, left it in the hands of the case officer. And they're also proposing some habitat enhancement. I think they're going to work with Felton Common as well. If obviously, I don't know whether that's contingent on the application being allowed or not. It might be that they do that anyway. And then this was actually brought up at the planning committee, which was interesting, this kind of debate about net loss of habitat, which is an interesting one. And I think if it was coming forward now, even a year later, we probably would have asked for a net gain calculator, which is being brought forward. But at the time, we were a little bit further behind with that perhaps. But we were pretty confident. If you look at the plan, there was about 18 different areas of habitat enhancement on site, including some positive management of the pretty naff sycamore woodland that the horseshoe bats are surprisingly using, a bit like Littlewood. Those bats are travelling there, and it's actually, the edges of it are lit as well. So it's this tiny little pocket of woodland in the northeast corner, and the bats are actually travelling there. So, and the junction was just taking the corner off it. So that will hopefully be managed in a positive way, and the lighting was pretty sensitive. So overall, there was not any evidence that there would be net loss of habitat, and the consultants did a very thorough job with the ecological surveys. So sometimes actually I object to applications quite often because the consultants haven't done a thorough enough job, or they've underestimated the importance of sites. And in this case, I couldn't object on that basis. So and the planning officer in this case actually recommended. The planning officer basically looks at all the evidence, and it was their decision that this didn't breach any planning policy in their view. But obviously the planning committee is entirely entitled to disagree, and some of these policies are not clear cut. Even some of the technical evidence isn't clear cut, and there were some good points made, and it was decided to refuse the application by the elected members. I think on further discussions, it was decided biodiversity wasn't a strong enough reason for refusal, based on some of the information that I'd put together. So the planning appeal, I haven't been tracking it. I don't know what's going on. Some of you will know more than me. And as far as I know, biodiversity is not being discussed at the planning appeal at the moment. This one, the only reason for bringing this one up, it's not in North Somerset, it's over in Baines where I work, is just to say that you do have some influence in the planning process. So you don't need to worry about all the details of this, but the headline really is that there were some nesting birds on site, probably, and there was some reptiles. And if anyone knows their reptiles, they'll know October isn't a great time for surveys. So when this came in 2020, I said, well, that's out of date and you've done a bit of a dodgy reptile survey, so I want an update survey. A few months later, the public started phoning me, a few phone calls a day, and telling me that the site was being cleared and burnt. So unfortunately, I also had 2 councillors pretty much, emailing me every couple of days because they're also really concerned. So I recommended, unfortunately, that we didn't have any powers as a local authority. We only have powers to stop site clearance if there's a planning condition against that scheme, which we didn't have in this case. So if it's a legal breach, the law applies independently of the planning process and it's a matter for the police. So this was referred to Avon and Somerset Police. The police said they couldn't do anything about it. But in my position in the local planning authority, I need to make sure that obviously all the law and policy need to be met. So as a result of the local people reporting, local residents reporting this, it was put on my radar. Otherwise I might I've got a survey that said the site's changed, it's different, it's been managed years ago. You don't need to ask for a survey anymore. But instead I was made aware that there was potentially a wildlife crime, and I could use it as a hook to ask for some really good mitigation and compensation. Obviously, we'd rather wildlife crime didn't happen in the first place. We can't endorse wildlife crime, but if the police aren't going to investigate it, there's not very much I can do except for try and get the best out of this scheme, which is what I did. So yeah, just to say that reporting these issues does actually make a difference. After all that work, about 4 or 5 responses, all the phone calls and emails, the application was still refused anyway, even though I was actually happy with it in the end, on one basis, which was that there's a tree next door where it's not possible to demonstrate, and it was never possible to demonstrate that that tree could be protected in the scheme. So the thing is, if it goes to appeal, and if the appeal is allowed, same with Bristol Airport, at least I know that there'll be a good or a less terrible outcome for biodiversity than there could have been, which is sometimes where I need to get to with my responses. This is one where I'm sure Graham and Tony will be smiling. I'm not going to talk about this loads, and again, if anyone wants a discussion of this at the end, I'm sure we can have that, and I believe some of the final details are still being bottomed out, so I'm not going to talk too much about this, but again, this is just showing you what those guidance documents, the power that they can have. And this is the picture on the top right is again the density banding from the supplementary planning document on bats, and it shows that edge of Congressbury where this application is in band A, so it's that really important bit for the bats. And the other picture there is actually from the SPD as well, and it shows where the really important fields for foraging bats are, and you can see there's not actually very many. This is for the juvenile bats and the females when they're lactating. There's not very many around the edge of Kingswood at all, and there's some radio tracking going on this summer that will hopefully bottom out whether they're actually using a slightly wider area. But I think we have to assume that very edge of Congsbury there is probably really, really important for those horseshoe bats, whether it's foraging juveniles or when they're dispersing in the autumn. And any areas, those fields as well, don't guarantee that those are going to be grazed or cattle grazed. So cattle grazing around that area, there's not actually that many cows in fields now around that area. So that Copthorne Way site where there were cows in fields sometimes is actually really important. And as a result of some of the, I'm not going to go into all the detail of the ins and outs of the planning process, but basically that was a hook for the developer to need to, there were some other reasons as well, including drainage and that kind of thing. But it was a hook for the developer to need to actually provide some habitat on site for foraging horseshoe bats and dispersing horseshoe bats. And as a result, they engaged with YACWAG, and hopefully, there's been some negotiation, but it's still, I think, intended that YACWAG will be on board and facilitate the cattle grazing there. And it's a really good example, actually, of where I think development's going when it's done right, hopefully done right. And there's a huge opportunity at the moment for organisations to engage with developers. There's not a lot of funding for conservation. It's not funded in the way it used to be. And actually, there is a big drive towards encouraging a green economy. And I definitely think that there'll be more of this happening, and that there'll be more opportunities for kind of landscape scale or off-site compensation. And YACWAG and other organisations are really well placed. I think Avon Needs Trees was talking about how it engages with developers or thinks about it. And I think a lot of organisations are quite cautious, and quite rightly so. But there will be huge opportunities, and it's going to need to be very carefully considered about how conservation organisations engage, because they really are, particularly organisations like YACWAG, really are the best placed organisations to deliver on schemes like this. And this is why it's coming. North Somerset, I've talked quite a bit tonight about the metric and the way it works for bats, but it might surprise you to know, if you don't already, that the national government, driven by Michael Gove of all people, the person I'd least expect to be an environmental activist perhaps, is bringing forward this environment bill. Hopefully, hasn't been brought forward yet, but it's had, I think, its second or third reading in Parliament, and that will make it mandatory for any development, with very few exceptions, to provide at least 10% gain in biodiversity, and that will need to be demonstrated through a metric. The metric isn't perfect, but it's much better than what we've got now. So even loss of, for example, pretty naff, poor, semi-improved grassland will have to be compensated for and actually enhanced through this net gain. So it's going to be a huge tool for us to be able to ask for developments to include more green space. And if they can't provide it on site, they will have to provide it off site. And actually, in some local authorities, we're doing this in Baines at the moment, we're thinking about perhaps a call for sites at some point, like they do in the local plan, but for habitat banking. We are bringing forward our own local plan policy to do with net gain. This will become law at some point, supposedly. So, you know, it will happen pretty quickly. And Lichfield, for example, and other authorities are already asking and insisting on 20% net gain. Where I work in South Cambridgeshire, any scheme over 10 houses, we're insisting on a metric, and we're insisting on demonstration of 10% net gain. And Bristol are actually looking at this as well. I did a job for them last summer. I promise I've only got a couple more slides. Yeah, promise. I'll finish in 3 minutes. And this was looking at schemes across Bristol, looking at the land they own and how that could be brought forward, and perhaps money from development harnessed or other means harnessed to enhance them. And a lot of them are pretty rubbish at the moment. So it is quite exciting that they're looking at these networks of enhancement. And this is the kind of thing it can deliver. So this is one of my South Cambridgeshire sites that I looked at. This is actually quite an old scheme now, like 3 years ago. But you're kind of looking at developments looking more like this in future, with perhaps a third of the area being green space and semi-natural green space to deliver biodiversity net gain. So it really will change things quite dramatically. And again, this is another South Cambridgeshire scheme. It's actually YACWAG wanted to put in this new unit, and it was quite controversial. It was last year at the time. And as a result of a little bit of habitat loss on site, particularly for invertebrates, they have had this phenomenal scheme that is going to create quite a lot of species-rich grassland, and they're also going to look at managing the nearby SSSI through contributions. So it's actually pretty amazing what this is harnessing, and the kind of conversations that this is harnessing. And the local wildlife trust are actually working with YACWAG on this site, and it's the most supportive I've ever seen the wildlife trust over there be about any scheme. And actually even the newspapers are picking up on it and kind of highlighting biodiversity net gain and making sure kind of, you know, that people understand it and know about it, which I was really impressed with how this was written up actually, and how accurate it was. So yeah, so it's a really good time to be interested in biodiversity, and there are some things you can do. So I did say I'd wrap up now, so there we go. Responding to consultations is important. There's actually one on the North Somerset Green Infrastructure Strategy at the moment that I would encourage people to respond to, that is relevant in our local area. The local plan I've already mentioned. Sign up to alerts, talk to other people, find out when they're going on, and respond either collectively or individually. You can screen and search for planning applications in your area, or you can just comment whenever one affects you very personally. That's totally fine. I would recommend, from a biodiversity point of view, you can do whatever you like from a kind of, you know, a personal point of view, but from a biodiversity point of view, the things that I would avoid is just kind of saying that everything is important. For example, things like deer aren't protected, things like squirrels aren't protected. It's about picking your battles. It's about trying to use an evidence-based argument. It's about looking at the guidance and the law and working out where you think the issues actually are diversity. It's about kind of almost pretending you're a local authority ecologist like me, trying to be objective and looking at where in that scheme there would be an issue. And there's plenty of schemes where there are issues, but there's also plenty of schemes where there aren't. So it's about kind of making biodiversity a big deal where it should be a big deal, basically. Respond within deadlines, obviously. Make sure that evidence-based, I've already said that, and try and be objective. Another thing you can do is you can send your records to BRERC, the local record centre, and also to North Somerset if you feel they're particularly important. And this is one that I would say, don't be afraid to contact applicants. So if it's your neighbour and you know they've got a bat roost, they might just not be aware. So it's worth definitely contacting them in the first instance. Ecological consultants, and that goes both sides. So if you look on the planning portal and there's an ecological consultant who's done a survey, you know, in the field next to you, and you know there's grass snakes there, but they haven't picked that up in their survey, just give them a call, let them know, make your representation to them. And also, I have seen this before as well with planning applications, is it works really well if you have a serious issue or concerns about a scheme. Ecological consultants, we're not like lawyers. You can get a good ecological consultant to work for you for about 30 to 50 quid an hour. And it would only take them a few hours to look at a planning application and get you a response. So particularly if you chip in together. So you can actually get a professional response submitted as a representation to planning applications, which if they're important enough perhaps. And I have seen that done successfully. Certainly when I'm on the other side of the fence, when I'm sitting in the local authority and I get a response from a professional ecologist that's basically a rebuttal or you know, critiquing someone else's work, I do take that very seriously because it's coming from a professional. So it's really important. And actually, speak to developers. I mean, that might sound daft, but I can tell you that in South Cambridgeshire at the moment, there is a SWIFT group, which is only 3 or 4 very committed people, and they are getting invited to meetings on these massive schemes with developers because they have gained such credibility. Even before the planning application comes in, those 3 or 4 people are being invited to the table with developers and being able to influence the scheme, which is pretty incredible. Developers are actually getting on board with biodiversity in some cases. You know, it still can be hit and miss, and there's developers who certainly, you know, definitely do not take duties to do with biodiversity seriously, but there's lots who do, or who are interested in engaging and doing the right thing, and they will have to with biodiversity net gain. So I would encourage, you know, you to actually, as well as making your representations to local authority formally, you are able to contact. I mean, obviously don't kind of play Sherlock Holmes and start phoning people up and harassing them or anything like that. But certainly in a ethical and professional way, kind of contacting these people is absolutely okay, and in some cases gets really good results. Yeah, so be ambitious. Obviously we've got, and have some really good examples, and I have faith that it does make a difference. So this is a really lovely example that's been secured through the planning process, is Portbury Wharf Nature Reserve, which is a really fabulous example of mitigation and enhancement that's been delivered through a planning obligation. It's not perfect, as anyone knows who knows Portbury Wharf will know, it's not all been done perfectly. But it is really now really fabulous for wildlife through a lot of people's hard work and effort, and the security of that site through the planning system, which is pretty incredible. And this is another one which you can look up on the RSPB website. It's called the Windmill Estate. It's over in Fulbourn in South Cambridgeshire, and there's actually more swifts now on that site than there was before the development. It's really incredible. Local people were asked what was important to them in the development, and they all said swifts, and as a result, yeah, there's actually just a phenomenal number there. It's like a utopia when you go there. It's just absolutely incredible. And that's the same SWIFT group that are now getting to the table with these big developers. So you can actually, you know, if you're really passionate about something, you can actually make a difference. So yeah, sorry that's gone on a little bit longer than planned. We had a little bit of a late start as well, but I am happy to stick around for questions. I'll have a little look in the chat and see if there's any questions as well. But so a few questions. Shall I start with the Zoom ones? So if local authorities declare a climate and ecological emergency, can that influence planning decisions? The answer is absolutely yes. It already is. It already is. So I can't really talk too much about this, but it is in the public domain. Over in Baines, we had a really challenging scheme that was a council-owned scheme, and I objected from an ecological point of view. I mean, this is all on the planning portal, but I'm not going to tell you which scheme. And the planning officer recommended approval despite my objection. The planning committee decided to approve, very close run, despite my objection. And there's been huge questions. It's made the national media, that site, and there's been huge questions about that scheme because of the Baines's ecological emergency. And I've had questions that I've had to answer from the chief executive of our council and our leader. So, you know, I would say I can't comment on the climate emergency, but certainly the ecological emergency and the declaration does make a difference, or it is starting to make a difference. It's early days, but yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, I can't really comment on North Somerset in the next 100 years after sea level rise and the viability of that, but certainly, yeah, that's going to be something to consider. That's a bit beyond my remit. That's kind of more to do with flooding, but it certainly might change things, and it might actually add some pressure to areas that, in terms of development, that you know, it might actually constrain us even more. Strategic view on what I'd like to see across North Somerset. I mean, I think, to be honest, it's quite difficult with planning because, as I said, you kind of deal with things on a case-by-case basis, and actually some of these landscape scale approaches, net gain, is going to really change the way we do things, and we're going to be able to do things on a more strategic basis. And we've got something as well that alongside this net gain in the Environment Bill, we've got something called nature recovery networks, and that I think is I'm really hopeful that that will start to help us really kind of facilitate some proper change for biodiversity. So yeah, don't know if anyone's got any questions other than the ones in the chat.
Any other questions?
No.
I've probably gone on a bit long, so
Sarah, I'd like to thank you. I mean, you've really gone into some depth there. We've got no excuse now not understanding what's going on, and particularly when YACWAG puts in an objection. I thought it was very interesting. You mentioned Cobthorne Way. I think it is actually exciting. It was always going to be an exciting thing, a unique thing. I think that sometimes intent and delivery are difficult issues. And I think the policy is obviously good, right, and it's achieved something. I think in terms of the planning system, and I'm not going to look at it now, the whole business of Section 106 and how you actually manage that is something which is a separate part of the system and needs looking at, really. But we're hoping that we can overcome some difficulties there and actually get delivery. From a biodiversity point of view, I think the point I think you made earlier is that any mitigation needs to be considered in advance, so that in effect that you make sure that harm doesn't occur whilst the development's going on, and as far as possible there is something there for biodiversity in the meantime. So really, in the ideal case, you'd get your mitigation up and running before you really do too much development. In this case, it would be cattle grazing on the bit of land that had been set aside. That hasn't happened, so in consequence, you've probably lost a year or two's grazing in a very sensitive area. But we live and we will move on with that particular application. So thank you very much, Sarah, for coming along and giving the talk. And there's a lot there for us to think about. Also, I would like to remind you all that having looked now at land, on the 8th of April, we'll be looking at wilder waterways. And so this is the Land Yo talk by Bernie Darcy from the Avon Wildlife Trust. That's a very interesting sort of project that's going on there that we'll be looking at. So is there anything else I should say?
No, I don't think so.
Julie, can I just say that thank you, Julie, for we do apologise for the delay to this the late running, right. And apologies to you, Sarah, for that as well. But again, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming along, and watch this space. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.